Right, hi everyone. Hi, welcome to our first virtual Big Questions event. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Alice. I'm a first year biology student here at Newcastle University, and I'm also joined by Anne. We're hosting this event today. We're both part of the Newcastle Christian Union. Hi Anne, how are you doing?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing, Alice?
Good, thank you. How are you finding quarantine?
It's been okay. I've past few days enjoying the weather while it was there, so it's been okay this week. Yeah, what about you?
Not bad, yeah, same really. Are you bored enough to start doing your uni work, yeah?
Kind of. I've kind of put it off because of the weather, but I feel like now I kind of have to get back to it, yeah.
Yeah, fair enough, fair enough. And we're also joined by Michael. Hi Michael, how are you?
Hi, good, thank you.
Good. So would you like to introduce yourself, tell us who you are, what you do, where you're from?
Great, yes. My name's Michael Otts. The name actually comes from Estonia, although I was born here in the UK in Leicester. So I grew up, studied in Edinburgh, lived for a lot of my life in Bournemouth down on the south coast, but now I live in Marlow in Buckinghamshire, just outside London, along with my wife. We've lived here for about 5 months now. So yes, weren't expecting to be in the house as much as we have been when we moved in, but yes, we have spent a lot of time in this home. But we're very blessed. We live in a nice place, and we have a bit of outdoor space, which is great. And I work amongst university students, both here in the UK but in other parts of Europe, speaking at events maybe a little bit like this, looking at some of the big topics of life, big questions of life, looking at how the Christian faith interacts with that. Normally that would be physically, obviously, at universities. I was in Newcastle not too long ago, just over a year ago. But at the moment, that's all happening from my dining room, come study/office. But it's great to be able to be at things like this today. Thanks.
Yeah, great. So how are you finding quarantine generally? Are you bored? Who are you quarantining with? How's it going?
Well, I'm quarantining with my wife, so that's good. We got married actually in January, which turns out to be the best month of 2020 to get married, possibly the only month of 2020 that anyone could get married. So we're very thankful for that. In some ways, it's been lovely. We're here together. We live in a nice part of the country. I get to ride my bike on pretty empty roads every morning, which is lovely. And the weather's been great most of the time, so that's not been bad. I guess like everyone else, we miss seeing family, miss seeing friends. Added to that, my wife, she works as a pilot in the airline industry. So for her at the moment, things are very uncertain because there's been massive job losses announced, but we don't yet know who is going to be made redundant. So it's a strange time enjoying the good things that we have, but also along, I guess, with many other people, uncertainties of what will happen in the future and what that will mean for us.
Yeah, of course, right. And have you got any skills you're trying to learn over quarantine? Have you got anything you want to know by the end of it?
Quarantine skill. Well, this is the funny thing. So I came then into quarantine like everyone else and thought, oh, great, I'm going to get all these things done. I'm going to write a book. I'm going to do all sorts of stuff that I haven't had time to do. And then actually I've ended up being busier than normal because I've ended up doing a lot of talks for different groups, student groups and churches, different parts of the UK and Europe. So all my best laid plans have not happened. As far as I expected. I guess the one thing that we have learned is we've learned to cook a lot of new meals. So we've quite enjoyed that. Yeah, I've learned to bake all sorts of stuff, which has been great. Enjoying eating.
Very nice. Right, I'll hand over to Anne now. She's going to explain what will happen next.
Awesome. Thank you, Alice. Thank you, Michael. So today we're going to be listening to a short talk from Michael. And just a quick rundown of how things are going to go. So at the end of the talk, you will have the opportunity to ask any questions. And so how this is going to work. So we're going to have live questioning through Slido, and hopefully that should appear on the screen. Yeah. So for Slido, the event code that we're going to be using is 92150. And it should be on the screen. There we go, 92150. Yeah, so you can type in your questions in at any time during the talk, and again, I'll remind you at the end of the talk that you can do so as well. It would be great if you could log into Slido now. One of the best things about Slido is even if you don't have any questions, you can see what other people are putting in anonymously and upvote questions so that if you would like them to be answered, we're more likely to answer them at the end. We also have a second option of how to ask us questions, and that is through texting us to the phone number, which is on the screen, and all the information is again below this YouTube video. But the number is 075 9044 3024. And again, hopefully that should be on the screen. So before I hand it over to Michael, I would just love it if you could all maybe respond, and we'll try this thing out. If you could let us know where you're joining us from today. So yeah, I'll just give you some time to do that. Leeds, brilliant. Thank you. I myself am joining you from Lancaster, which is in the northwest, not too far from Newcastle. Thank you. Some more places. Wokingham, hope I said that correctly. Marlow. Brilliant. Yeah, just keep them pouring in, guys. But yeah, that's brilliant. Thank you. Just to check that all works. Nottingham, brilliant. Bedfordshire, awesome. Thank you, thank you. Yeah, so a massive welcome to you all who are still joining us. Yeah, so I think I will hand it over to Michael, if that is okay with Michael.
This afternoon. And let me just explain again, I'm going to speak for about 20 minutes, 25 minutes before we have a chance to go to questions. So do keep Slido open if you can do that, and watch at the same time if you've got two devices. And you can be writing your questions, but also obviously voting on other people's questions that you think might be particularly good. So please feel free to do that as we go through. But we're looking this afternoon at this topic, 5 things that the coronavirus epidemic makes us think about. It's hard to underestimate, isn't it, just how much our world has changed in such a short space of time. Who of us would have imagined just how 2020 would have panned out? I guess none of us. Even just at the beginning of March, did we expect our lives to be so impacted by what has happened? And yet they have been, haven't they? All of us have been affected one way or another. Obviously, there are the direct implications of those who have suffered from COVID-19 themselves, those who've been sadly bereaved by it. Maybe you know people yourselves who've been impacted in this way. But then, of course, there are all the knock-on implications, the indirect implications, you might say, of this, as we find ourselves not at university where we'd like to be, perhaps, but sitting at home, having to do everything from our base that we've been stuck in for now a number of weeks. And of course, there are all the concerns and anxieties about the future. What is this going to mean for our country, for the economy, for our job prospects, for our careers, and so on? All sorts of uncertainties that this brings about. And it does make us ask questions, doesn't it? It makes us think about maybe things that we don't always think about. It makes us think about our world and why it seems to be so broken and so uncertain. It makes us think about human nature and why people can be, on the one hand, so selfless and yet on the other hand, so selfish. It makes us think about the foundation of our lives. What are we building our lives on? What is certain in a world that's so uncertain? I guess it certainly maybe makes us think about death, because we are confronted every day with the numbers of people who are dying in our country, in our continent, in our world. And of course, it also makes us ask questions about hope. Is there any hope for our world? Is there any hope for us? And where is that to be found, and on what is it to be based? So it's for some of these things I'd love us to think about this afternoon for a few minutes before we go to your questions. So firstly, I think it makes us think about our world. We live in a world which is both beautiful and yet broken, don't we? This is brought home to me just the other day. I was out on a beautiful cycle ride in the Chiltern Hills, just outside the town where I live. And it was a beautiful spring day. The sun was shining, the birds were singing, the blossom was on the trees. It was just gorgeous. And then I cycled back down into the high street of our town. And I saw a deserted high street with empty shops and the ever-present queue outside Sainsbury's. And it suddenly brought back to me the reality of the world in which we live. It's a weird place, isn't it? I was having dreams last night of being at a big public event, and I woke up and I realized, of course, that just can't happen at the moment. And when is it going to happen? But how do we explain our world? Yes, there is so much brokenness, and yet there is still lots of stuff that's really beautiful and good. How do we make sense of that? Well, some people might say, well, it's just the way the world is. Some people get lucky, some people don't. And at the end of the day, if you think about it, if the only explanation that we have for who we are and how we came into being is a story that says that the strong have always survived at the expense of the weak, then surely what we're seeing at the moment is just a continuation of that, right? The strong will probably survive, and the weak and the vulnerable generally don't. And yet, most of us, I guess, aren't content to think that that's just the way things should be. And certainly, if you look at the way our governments have responded to this crisis, as much as we critique them, most of the response has been to say that we should care for those who are vulnerable and weak. It's not okay for the strong to survive at the expense of the weak. So how do we make sense then of not only the goodness of our world, but its brokenness? How do we make sense of this sense of intrinsic value that we think that all people have, no matter how old or young? Well, I think one of the things I find really attractive about the Christian faith is that it does seem to account for and make sense of these things that are really important to us. It doesn't mean it explains everything or it has exhaustive answers to all of our questions, but it does seem to make sense. It makes sense of the goodness in our world because it says this world is a good creation of a good God created for us to enjoy. But it also says that we live in a world that has gone wrong. The Bible storyline says the world we live in is not the way it once was. It says that because people have turned their back on the God who created them and cut themselves off from the source of life and the source of love, then nothing is quite as it should be. Everything has been affected by that. Not only us and our relationships are affected by that, but the Bible says, to use the words of one book in the New Testament, the whole creation is groaning, it's broken, it's longing to be set free. It's not what it should be. The Bible also accounts, though, for that sense of value that we place upon every human life, because the Bible says that all of us are valuable because we're created in the image of God. It's not our usefulness to society that gives us value. It's not our capabilities or our capacities that give us value. It's intrinsically who we are that gives us value. We're not human doings, we're human beings, according to the Bible. We are created in the image of God with real value, which is why all people matter. And which is why any response to this pandemic needs to account for the value of every human life. So the Bible says we live in a good world, but it is broken. And we've been reminded, haven't we, of that brokenness in the last few weeks. And yet, in a weird way, it's surprising that maybe we're only just starting to think about this now, because at the end of the day, if we turn on the news in any given week of our lives, we would have seen brokenness, right? We would have seen war and conflict, possibly earthquakes and tsunamis, famine, disease, injustice. It's not just started a few weeks ago, it's always been there in different ways and different forms. The difference is, though, that normally it's in other parts of the world, isn't it? Normally it's happening to other people. And normally it's kind of easy to stop thinking about such things by just flicking off our remote control or turning off our phone. But now we can't do that, can we? Because even when we turn our TV news off, we're continually reminded by the very situation we're in that things aren't what they should be. C.S. Lewis, the Oxford professor who wrote the Narnia books, amongst many others, put it this way. He said, God whispers to us in our pleasures. He speaks to us in our conscience, but he shouts at us in our pain. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. And maybe that's one of the things that's happened in recent weeks. We've actually been woken up to what our world is really like and forced to ask questions about why the world is the way it is and how we can account for that. I think the Bible helps us to do that. But I guess another thing it makes us think about, though, is this. It makes us think about ourselves, or in other words, human nature. Because there's something about a crisis that brings out the best and the worst in human nature, isn't there? I mean, think about what we've seen in the last few weeks. We've seen great acts of selflessness, the incredibly hard work of those in the NHS and other key industries, risking their health, their lives potentially, to help others at this particular time. We saw 500,000 people in one day volunteer to help the NHS. We've seen great acts of appreciation for the work they do. We've seen communities coming together, not physically, but metaphorically, to help each other, to look out for each other. That's been brilliant, hasn't it, to see all of that? But on the other hand, we've seen selfishness. We've seen people stockpiling essential provisions so that other people can't get what they need. We've seen apparently a 50% increase in domestic violence as people find themselves locked down in abusive and difficult relationships. We've seen hypocrisy. Just think about Professor Neil Ferguson, whose research led to the government's response on this situation, and particularly the lockdown that we're now in. And yet we read last week that he himself broke the very lockdown that he was recommending to continue an affair with a married woman. So what is it about a crisis? Well, I want to suggest that it's not so much that a crisis makes people bad or makes people good, but in other words, it reveals what we're already like. It reveals what's going on in our lives, maybe in a very real way. It's like it's holding up a mirror to human nature. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that there are some people out there who are just perfectly wonderful people and other people who are just despicable, awful people. I'm sure Neil Ferguson's work in his science has been incredibly hard, and I'm not wanting to diminish that. But the reality is that maybe if we're really honest, we have to admit that all of us can show signs of both selflessness and selfishness. All of us can be good, and yet, on the other hand, sometimes we're not. Maybe we have to admit that even in the situations we're locked down into, we find it hard to love the people we're around 24/7. We find it hard not to snap or to be selfish or to think about our own interests first. Now again, how do we account for that? The fact that we can be, on the one hand, so good and on the other, so bad. Well, again, the Bible accounts for that by saying that because we're created in the image of this good God, we are capable of reflecting what he's like in loving acts of self-sacrificial service. But because also we've cut ourselves off from that God, we've cut ourselves off from the source of love, we're also capable of doing, well, the opposites. Coldplay, the band, in one of their early songs have this question. It's a song called Clocks, and they ask the question, am I part of the cure or part of the disease? Speaking, of course, metaphorically. But I guess what they're saying is we want to be part of the cure. We want to think that we are part of the answer to the problems out there, but sometimes we're part of the problem, aren't we? Sometimes our actions, sometimes our inaction are part of the problems with our world. And that's why I want to say Christianity is really good news, because Christianity doesn't just show us what the problem is, it also offers a solution. And it doesn't say the solution is to become religious, to follow rituals and regulations and rules, but it says the solution is in a rescue. It's in the story of a God who came into this broken world, experiencing the brokenness of this world himself. And then through his voluntary and costly and painful death, he was going to make it possible for us to be forgiven and transformed. The Christian faith is a message of forgiveness and inner transformation, that we might become new people, set free from the things that are so self-destructive. Christianity doesn't say we need to make ourselves better by self-effort, but it offers this wonderful story of a rescue. We can be rescued from the destructive side of our own human nature, forgiven for all our failings, and then changed to become the people that God has made us to be. I think it's amazing over the last few weeks to see the way people have appreciated the sacrificial service of people in things like the NHS. People who have risked their lives to care for others. But I also find it amazing as a Christian to think of the story of the Christian faith, of a God who didn't just risk his life, but gave his life for us so that we might experience this kind of transformation and change. But also I'd say, thirdly, this whole pandemic makes us think about our lives, and particularly the foundation of our lives as well, doesn't it? Maybe in the last few weeks, we've suddenly realized that some of those things in our lives that seem so certain, so secure and so strong are not quite as secure as they used to be. We had plans and suddenly they've all been stripped away. Who knows what we're going to be doing for the rest of the year? But we've also got uncertainties about the future. What will happen to our career prospects? What are we going to do when we leave university? What's going to happen to the economy? What are the knock-on implications going to be for our world? And then we find ourselves in difficult situations where we're stripped of the real relationships that give our lives so much meaning. Yes, we can Zoom and we can chat, but it's not the same, is it? Where do we turn when all these important things in our lives start to get stripped away? And what's left when we strip them all away? Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying that, our relationships or our career prospects are unimportant. They are important. They're important parts of who we are, and they make up our identity, or at least part of it. But here's the problem. If we base our identity, our lives, our futures on a job or on a relationship, what happens when that job doesn't materialize? Or when we get made redundant, or one day when we retire? What happens when that relationship, so precious and important, tragically comes to an end? Because the reality is that at some point in our lives, everything that we look to give us meaning and value does get stripped away. What do we have left then? The wonderful thing I'd say about being a Christian is that it gives you a foundation to your life that nothing can actually shake. That no coronavirus pandemic, no circumstance, no crisis can actually take away. Because being a Christian isn't just about experiencing the forgiveness of God so that we might be forgiven for what we've done, but it means coming into a relationship with that God who loves us and has made us. It means experiencing his love day by day in a real life-changing way. And it means coming into relationship with the family of other Christians. We call it the church. A family that can support and care for each other. Sure, church buildings are closed, but churches are more active than ever in caring for and loving and supporting each other as a family and as a community brought together by Jesus. And that wonderful foundation of a relationship with God and a relationship with other Christians is something that can give us security in life no matter what happens. It doesn't mean we don't get upset when things that are important to us get taken away. But it means that we have real confidence that ultimately nothing can take away the most precious thing in our lives. Not even death can do that. And I wonder, listening today, do you know what that security is like? Have you ever experienced that real relationship with God in Jesus that can give you that sense of confidence in life? The fourth thing I want to say is this. Coronavirus also makes us think about death, doesn't it? It may not be popular to say that, but it's kind of pretty obvious, isn't it? When we sit in a situation day by day, looking at the numbers of people who died in our country, in our world, it's hard not to think about death. And yet in a weird way, why do we only do that now? Surely that's something we should do anyway. C.S. Lewis again, writing in the Second World War, said something profoundly interesting. I was just reading it the other day. He said, war does not increase the probability of our death. He says, our death has always been 100% probable. He says, it's going to happen at some point. He says, war doesn't make it more probable. It might make it more soon, though. But it's still going to happen at some point. And he also goes on to say, what war does is it makes us think about it in a way that we don't. And maybe coronavirus does the same. Maybe it makes us think about this reality called death in a way that we don't at other times in our life. Now, maybe we're not so worried about coronavirus ourselves. We figure maybe because our health is good and our age is young that it won't affect us in that way, and hopefully it won't. But the reality is the same, that ultimately at some point in life, 1 out of 1 die. Why don't we think about it? I mean, we think lots about stuff that doesn't happen in life or may not happen. Why not think about something that will definitely happen? I guess one of the reasons maybe is that for all the technology that we have, for all of our advances that we've made in Western civilization, we still don't have an answer to that most huge of problems. Where do we turn? And again, one of the things I find incredible about Jesus is that Jesus didn't just claim that he had some kind of philosophical answer to death, but he actually claimed that he was the answer to death. And in a funeral situation where a good friend of his had died, as he tries to comfort the grieving sisters of this man, he says these incredible words. He says, I am the resurrection and the life. Whoever believes in me will live even though they die. Incredible and audacious statements, isn't it? Jesus is saying that he is the one we can trust with our death. And in a world where we will all die, isn't that kind of relevant? Look, I'm nearly done, but there's one last thing I want to say, and that is this. Coronavirus makes us think about the need for hope as well. I don't know about you, but I've found myself looking at my phone a lot more over the last few weeks. I'm not just talking about kind of checking WhatsApp or stuff like that, but I keep checking the news. I don't know about you. I'm there on the BBC news feed, like it's been going now for like 2 months without stopping. And we want to kind of be checking what's going on, don't we? And why do we do that? Why is that a kind of thing that seems to happen so much at a time like this? Well, I guess partly it's because we want to know what's going on. We want to know what Boris had to say last night. We want to know whether we're going to be able to meet with people tomorrow, whether we'll be able to travel, those kind of things. Of course, that's important. But more than that, I guess what we're looking for is maybe a sense of hope. We want to see light at the end of the tunnel. We want to feel that maybe things at some point will return to normal. We long for news of a vaccine or an effective remedy to the situation. And yet so often our hopes get dashed, don't they? Maybe you sat there last night thinking, oh, is there not any more? Where is the hope at a time like this? Can the world go back to the way it was? There was a wonderful cartoon in a newspaper the other day, and it was a picture of God looking at planet Earth, and obviously in the context of the current pandemic. And there was an angel sitting nearby, and the angel said to God, why don't you just try turning the whole thing off and turning it back on again? I thought, it's kind of what we do, or at least what I do when technology goes wrong. I just pull it out from the wall and stick it back in again. That normally sorts out the Wi-Fi router, amongst other things. But here's the thing. I guess our heart's desire is, couldn't God just do that? Just reset it, turn things back to the way things were? But in a sense, do we want things just to go back to the way things were? I mean, yeah, sure, 2 months ago, 3 months ago, for us, things were better, weren't they? We weren't stuck in our homes. We were able to travel, go to watch sport, do whatever we like. But of course, 3 months ago, we were still living in a world where there was massive injustice. We were still living in a world where over 3 million children were going to die this year from lack of essential medication. We were still living in a world that was racked with conflict, war. So while, yeah, for us, things might have been a bit better a few months ago, we still weren't living in a world as it should be, were we? I want to suggest we don't just want to go back to the way things once were. Isn't it like deeper down in our hearts to desire that we could be in a world where none of these things were present? Not just no coronavirus, but no war, no conflict, no sadness, no cancer, no pain, no death. And the incredible story of the Christian faith is this, that actually one day the world is going to be that way. See, it's not so much that God is going to turn it off and turn it back on again, but the Bible does say that God is going to remake and restore this broken world. He's going to get rid of all that causes pain and suffering in it and make it not just back to the way it once was, but even better than it even could have been. And this hope is not just some pipe dream or fairy tale or illusion, but it's based on this incredible historical claim that Jesus rose from the dead. An event that you might want to ask about in the Q&A in a moment, because I haven't got time to go into all the evidence for it now, but an event that is compelling, an event that you can be persuaded of, convinced of when you start to look into. Not too good to be true, but so good because it is true. That's the Christian hope of the future. A hope, in the words of Tolkien, the author of The Lord of the Rings, that one day everything sad will come untrue. It's just an incredible hope that even if the worst would happen, the best is still yet to come for those who know and trust Jesus. It's just amazing. Now, you might have one final question before we wrap up, and that is, yeah, but how does that change things now? I mean, yeah, it's nice to know that if I die of coronavirus or something else, that's not the end. But does that change things now? I want something that's going to make a difference today. And I want to say that actually the hope that Christianity offers does make a difference today. Let me give you one example from history and one example from the present. This book, Rodney Stark, by Rodney Stark, a social historian, is a fascinating little introduction to the early growth of Christianity, the rise of Christianity. And as a secular social historian, he documents how Christianity grew in the first few centuries of the Christian church. And one of the things he says is that actually at times of great pandemic and plague in the Roman Empire, Christianity grew exponentially. It's amazing to read that some of the Roman cities were so devastated by plague that up to a quarter of the populations were killed. This is, on a scale that we can't even imagine. And yet during that time, the Christian church numerically was growing. Now, what happened? Well, what Rodney Stark says is this. At those times of plague and pandemic, unlike so many in the population, the Christian community stayed put and cared not only for each other when they succumbed to the plague, but also cared for other people who were not part of the Christian community. Now, this is not just documented by him. He's drawing on secular historians. Indeed, the Roman Emperor Julian talks about this, how outraged he is that the Christians would love people in such a way. And here they were risking their lives to care for other people. And of course, what happened is not only did Christians survive the plague more because they were being cared for, apparently it gave you about a 33% increased chance of survival, but other people embraced the Christian faith because they'd seen something of this incredible sacrificial love of these Christians who were willing to risk their lives to care in such a way. Now, Rodney Stark asked the question, were Christians somehow more courageous and brave than everyone else in society because they were able to do that? He says, actually, no. He says the difference was that these Christians were simply being consistent with what they believed, like everyone else. He said, look, if you believe that death is the end, then the worst thing that can happen to you in life is that you die, because that's the end of you. So you will do anything and everything to avoid death. But if you believe that death is not the end, if you believe in the resurrection of Christ that says that the best is yet to come, then actually you might be willing to risk even death to care and love and serve other people and to make a difference in the world. And that's exactly what Christians did. And actually, that's exactly what some Christians do today in this world in different ways, as they seek to bring help and healing and hope to people in desperately sick and difficult situations. You see, the Christian hope in the future is not some pie in the sky when you die malarkey. It is really impacting upon your life now. And it's people who've been gripped by that belief in the resurrection that have made a real difference in our world. Establishing hospitals, setting up schools, even universities, making a difference, shaping our world in the way that it has been so massively over the last few centuries. See, Christian hope really does make a difference. And on the personal level, it makes a difference too. Let me just finish with this. Some good friends of mine in Bournemouth, where I grew up, sorry, not where I grew up, but where I lived for a number of years, recently lost their daughter to cancer. She was in her mid-20s. I knew her. She was quite young when I first moved to Bournemouth. And for 2 years, she battled with cancer. For the first year with the hope that maybe she might be able to defeat it. But for the second year, in the realization that actually it was going to take her. And all the way through that 2-year period, she was documenting this journey on Instagram, explaining what was happening to friends and family. And on every single Instagram post that she put up, she put a hashtag at the end. And it was simply this: choose joy. That seems pretty absurd, doesn't it? That a girl facing her own imminent death could say over and over again, choose joy. How could she do that? Well, she could do that because actually she knew this hope that we talked about this afternoon. She knew that Jesus Christ was risen from the dead. She knew where her life was headed. In her words, she said, this is just a blip on the road to eternity. We're all just passing through. And she had the joy of knowing that actually this was not the end for her, but just the beginning. And it made such a difference to the way that she lived. See, the Christian hope in the future makes the good times better, but it also makes the hard times more bearable. And it gives us joy in the midst of even the hardest times. This is not some make-believe illusion. This can really make a difference today. I guess my question is, has it made a difference for you? Have you come to discover this for yourself? I don't know what you're thinking about what I've shared. We're going to go to questions in a moment. But before we do, let me just say, maybe you're sitting there thinking, I think this is rubbish. I don't believe a word you've said. I think this is just a kind of Freudian kind of wishful thinking. If that is the case, I guess my question to you would be, how else do you account for what we see in our world, its beauty and its brokenness, this sense of value that we have upon all human beings? Where does that come from? How do we explain it if it's not the story as we see in the Bible? Where do we find hope if we're going to reject this story? A hope that can take us through the darkest of times. And ultimately, what are we going to make of Jesus Christ, the figure at the center of this whole claim? And I kind of want to challenge you to say, why not take this time to read through one of the accounts of the life of Jesus for yourself and make up your own mind off the back of that, what you think about it. And we'd love to send you a copy of this book called Uncover. It's basically one of the historical accounts of the life of Jesus. There's some really good reasons for taking it seriously as a historical source, but it's also a brilliant way to get started looking at the central figure of Christianity, Jesus Christ. Why don't you get in touch, and we'd love to just tell you about how you can get that. We'll post one to you free of charge so you can start reading that for yourself. Maybe you're saying, actually, I kind of want to find out more about this. I'd love to kind of look into this further. Well, again, the guys in Newcastle would love to help you do that. And they're going to explain in a bit some stuff that will help you to be able to kind of investigate this further. They'd love to be in touch with you. They'd love to chat over Zoom or whatever, and just help kind of answer your questions and help you investigate further. But it may also be that, you're sitting here today and you're thinking, actually, I think this could be true. I think actually this does seem to begin to make sense of some of the things that seem so important in life. And actually, as you've thought about this, you're saying, actually, I'd love to know this for myself. I'd love to know what it is to have that security in life that nothing can shake. I'd love to know what it is to have that forgiveness that Jesus alone can offer. And I'd love to know that hope that can give me confidence, whatever life has to throw at me, that the best is yet to come because of what Jesus has done. And you can know that. It's offered to you as a gift. This relationship with God that we've spoken about today, it's a gift that we can receive, but just like any relationship, it needs to begin somewhere, doesn't it? And a relationship needs to be bought into from both sides. It doesn't work if it's only got one side investing in it. And we thought today about how God has incredibly invested in us, giving himself for us in Jesus. But have we ever committed to following him, starting that relationship, experiencing his love, and starting to walk our lives hand in hand with his? Well, if you haven't, why not do it today? Why not make today, this afternoon, in fact, the time when that begins for you? Why not talk to God and say, God, I'm sorry for the way I've kept you out of my life for so long. Thank you that you have incredibly loved me enough to do all of this for me. Please come into my life. Please forgive me. Help me to live with you from now on. And he will. And that will be the start of an incredible adventure. One of the words for Jesus in the Bible is that he's Emmanuel. He's God with us. And the beautiful thing is that there's no social distancing from a God like this. He can be with us wherever we are, and he wants to be with us today. So why not talk to him and do that and start that relationship, and then get in touch and let us know, because we'd love to help you as you get started in that. But that's enough for me from now. I'm going to hand back to our hosts, and hopefully there'll be some questions to look at in a moment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael, for sharing with us. It's definitely given us a lot to reflect about. And I'm sure if those of you watching, if you have more questions, I'd just like to remind you again how you can ask those. So again, the information is down below, but if you still like to ask questions, if you go to slido.com, the event code is 92150, and you can also text in your questions to the number 0759 044 3024. So yeah, that's that information for you. If it's okay with Michael, I'll hand over to Alice and we can start asking you questions.
Yeah, great. Okay, so the first question we have is, how can I believe in a God that let this coronavirus happen?
Yeah, and I guess that's one of the biggest questions we can ask, isn't it? Christianity talks about a God who is all powerful, created the universe, he's all loving. That's one of the descriptions of God. In fact, it says that God in his very being is love. And yet we live in a world of coronavirus, a pandemic, which is directly and indirectly massively impacting the lives of so many. How would a God of love allow that? And I guess it comes back to an old conundrum that was kind of spoken of many, many centuries ago, before coronavirus was even a thing. And that was to say, basically this: if God is loving, he would want to end something like this. If God was powerful, he would be able to end something like this. But we have this situation, therefore God cannot either be all loving or all powerful, certainly not the God as described in the Bible. That's the old kind of philosophical conundrum, you might say, that we have. And it's a challenging question to think through. I think one of the things that the Bible says is that the world we live in is not the way it once was. There was a French philosopher who said, if there is a God who created the world as it is today, that God would be the devil. And I kind of want to say, well, yeah, actually true. If God just created a world with, pandemics and plagues and death and disease and suffering and war, what kind of God would that show us? And that's why it's so important, as I was saying in the talk, that the Bible storyline says the world we live in is not the way it once was. one of the consequences of humanity's rejection of God has been that everything has gone wrong. And sometimes we see that directly, and we see suffering that is directly caused by the way people live in the world. We see that in conflict, in war, in broken relationships, and in so many other ways. But we see that also indirectly in what we might call natural evil. And the Bible says that humanity's turning away from God has had implications for the very fabric of the way our world works. But it's worth saying, even in those situations, it's often exacerbated and made worse by the actions of people. I mean, it's worth thinking through the fact that actually this situation may have been very different had there not been a massive cover-up at the beginning that suppressed the release of vital information in the early days. It's not to say that, you know, everything would have not happened, but even in situations of what we might call natural evil, human injustice, lies, and so on, and corruption certainly can exacerbate the suffering. And in our world today, it will be often the poor who will suffer more through this than the rich, and the weak and the vulnerable that will suffer too. So the Bible says we live in a world that's not the way it should be. And that's because people have freely chosen to turn off their backs on the God who's made them. God could have made it another way, of course. He could have made a world where people had no sense of choice at all. People had to do always the correct thing. Nothing could ever go wrong. That would be a world maybe without coronavirus, but it would also be a world without love. It would also be a world very different to our own, where we have real choices that have real consequences. But I'd also say, sorry, this is a long answer, but it's a big question. But although the Bible says the world we live in is not the way it once was, it also isn't the way it one day will be. And it holds out this amazing hope for the future. But that's a very brief answer to a very big question. You may want to come back on that if you were the one who asked the question with a more kind of specific response, and we'll deal with that if we get to that. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you, Michael. So the next question is, and there's two questions that kind of link together. Is Christianity just putting on a positive mindset to get through problems? And also, you say that the foundation of Christian faith is steady no matter what. How can then you explain Christians who lose their faith in difficult situations? Yes.
I'll deal with the first one first, if that's okay. And if you remind me the second, because there's lots that can be said on both.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah.
But no, it's okay. But they are connected. So yes, is Christianity just putting a kind of positive mindset on it, just to kind of help you through it? Now, it's very interesting that there have been a lot of studies that have been done that have shown that actually religious faith, in particular the Christian faith, does have a massive impact upon your psychological well-being. Secular psychologists like Jonathan Haidt have shown in his book, The Happiness Hypothesis, that a Christian faith can really have a massively positive impact upon your well-being, your sense of identity, and so and so. And by the way, that often gets forgotten by some of the more militant new atheists that like to say religion is really bad for you. Actually, there's plenty of documented evidence that says a genuine Christian commitment can really help you. But is that all it is? Is that all it is, just kind of wishful thinking? Well, as I said in the talk, the Christian faith is not so much too good to be true, but good because it is true. That's what I want to say. And the Christian hope is not based on some kind of, mere wish fulfillment in the future, a bit of a Freudian idea. I want there to be something beyond death, so I create this story that tells me there is such a thing. But actually, it's based on the resurrection of Jesus Christ. So one of the early Christians, a guy called Paul, writing in the New Testament, or what obviously became the New Testament, says this. He says, if Jesus Christ did not rise from the dead, then our faith is futile, and we are of all people most to be pitied, because we have believed in vain. In other words, he says, look, if Jesus Christ didn't rise from the dead, the whole Christian story is a complete waste of time. The Newcastle Christian Union is a complete waste of time. The whole thing is based on an illusion, and you shouldn't believe it. But actually, they were convinced that it was true. And interestingly, they were convinced and compelled in such a way that they were able to turn the world upside down, and all of the first-hand evidence was still to hand, which is something worth thinking about. So I'd say this is not just some kind of illusion, and this is based on historical claims. And the problem with saying, well, is Christianity just wish fulfillment? Of course, you can turn it around the other way, and you can say, well, this belief in some kind of God could also be a kind of wish fulfillment. I don't want there to be a day of judgment. I don't want there to be anything beyond death. I want to live as I want now. So it doesn't really help you get to the truth. To get to the truth, you've got to look at the base of the claim. And we'd say that the center of the claim is the resurrection. And again, you may want to come back on that and ask questions later. But remind me what the second question was then.
Yeah, so you said the foundation of Christian faith is steady no matter what. How can you explain Christians who lose their faith in difficult situations?
Yeah, so how do we explain Christians who lose their faith in difficult situations if we have this security? The reality is, I know people who would have once said that they were walking and following Jesus and were strongly committed Christians, and then through circumstances and situations have turned their back on God. I also know lots of people who were atheists who, because of difficult situations, have turned to God, which is very interesting. And just in the last few weeks, it's been fascinating to see. There was a study done by the University of Copenhagen that said that with every 50,000 new cases of coronavirus in the early stages, the number of Google searches for the word prayer went up by 50%. And certainly just last week in The Guardian, I was reading that 25% of the British population have been to church online in the last couple of months. So lots of people who wouldn't have necessarily even thought about God have started to think about God. So what we see is that suffering can turn people away from God, and it can also turn people to God. I think the question is, how do we respond to it at times like that? Now, one of the things it might make us do is to get bitter and say, well, as we said earlier, how can there be a loving God when stuff like this is happening to me, to my life, into this situation? And certainly if you have this kind of almost fatalistic view of God, that God is just sending all things into my life, or maybe a simplistic view, well, he loves me, so he's got a purpose in everything, that becomes hard when really bad stuff starts happening. But I think the thing that can help me to continue to believe in God through all of this is ultimately the cross, that Jesus died on the cross, because I see here is a God who loved me enough to give the most precious thing that he had for me, so that I might know him and have life. And so although I don't know why God allows certain things to happen, I know it's not because he doesn't care, because I look at the cross and I see that he really does care. And so the challenge in those situations is to keep my eyes on Jesus and to keep reading what God is like through what I see in Jesus, rather than what I see in my circumstances. Because when I look at my circumstances, I end up sinking. There's this amazing story in the Gospels of Peter. It's the famous story about Peter in the storm, and he gets out the boat to walk to Jesus as Jesus is walking on the water. And as he looks at Jesus, he's actually able to walk on the water. It's an incredible miracle. But then he looks down at the storm and he starts to sink. And I guess there's a picture in that, isn't there? When we keep looking at Jesus in the midst of storms, we can remain above them, as it were. When we start just focusing on the problem and take our eyes off Jesus, it's when we start to sink. And I guess that's the challenge, to make sure in those times that we keep our eyes on Jesus and not just looking at the situation around us. So for me as a Christian, that means making sure I'm reading the Bible, not just reading the BBC newsfeed. But all I'm doing is reading the newsfeed, I'm going to get pretty depressed. But as I look at Jesus, it reminds me of what God's like, and it helps me to keep trusting him.
Great, thank you so much. Okay, next question we've got is, many people turn to temptations like porn and drugs. How can we explain to our friends and close ones that these things destroy us?
Yeah, so many people turn to, I guess, comforts, right? Pornography, drugs, or just excessive amounts of alcohol at times like this. It's interesting, studies, I think it's basically made some people teetotal and some people alcoholics times of lockdown. But it does show that we kind of, we go one of two ways often in a situation like this. I guess the reality is, confronted with brokenness, what do we do? Confronted with a world that isn't as it should be, where do we turn? It's really hard looking at a world that's broken for any length of time without becoming really despairing. I guess one option is basically, we might call it escapism, which is, I don't want to think about it too deeply. How can I switch off from it? And if you want to switch off from it, then pornography, drugs and sex are pretty good ways of doing that, at least temporarily. The problem is the next day, the world is still the same broken world and your life is potentially in a bit more of a mess than it was before. Or the other option is to say, actually, I'm not going to escape from this, but I'm going to look at it head on. And that's why we kind of want to do the event today, because we're saying, actually, rather than just kind of ignoring this and saying, okay, I'm just going to watch more Netflix. Let's actually look at this broken world and say, there is hope that we can have in the midst of all of this mess. That means that I can continue to go forward with hope and joy, and I don't need to despair, and I don't need to turn to things that basically aren't going to get rid of the problem, and in the long run are just going to create a bigger problem for me and for the people around me.
Awesome, thank you. So the next question is a bit more personal. How has the coronavirus pandemic affected your faith in God?
Yeah, thank you for the question, and whoever asked it. As I said, in some ways, my wife and I have been very blessed in that we haven't been impacted in the way that some people have, certainly in other parts of the world, being locked down into a nice house in Buckinghamshire with an outdoor space and good health is, you know, an amazing blessing, and we're really thankful for it. As I also said, it also has led to uncertainty, particularly over the future, whether my wife's job will continue and the knock-on implications if she loses that, where we'll live and what we'll do. That's difficult, and it's hard sometimes living through those kind of uncertainties. And I think what it's done for us, is it's driven us back to some of the incredible promises in the Bible, very specific and personal promises that God makes to his children, to his people. There's a beautiful one in Philippians chapter 4 in the New Testament where it says, "Do not be anxious about anything, but in everything by prayer and petition with thanksgiving present your requests to God." A few years ago I learned that chapter in the Bible, and the bit that I always forgot was the little phrase "with thanksgiving," because so often we can pray about the things that we worry about, and that's a good thing to do, but we can forget to be thankful for the things that we have. And so I think for us it's been a case of reminding ourselves of what we have to be thankful for, which is a lot, especially in comparison with others, but also praying. And I had a lovely phrase the other day from a Spanish Christian psychiatrist, and he said what we need to do in times of crisis is to translate, just as we would from one language to another, our worries into prayers. So every time we have things that we worry about, he says you need to be a translator, taking those worries and turning them back to God in prayer. And actually, therefore, in times of anxiety, rather than turning away from God in bitterness, we can end up turning to God, praying to him. And then it says this wonderful promise. It says, "And the peace that passes all understanding will guard your hearts and minds in Christ Jesus." And we have to say that's a wonderful thing, to be able to say, actually, I know that God is with me. I can experience his peace. I don't know what the future holds. Don't know whether things are going to work out. Can't say that, you know, it's all going to be okay in a year's time. But I know that God's with us, and I know that he cares for me, for us, and I can keep trusting him during that.
Great, thank you. Next question. I'm a Christian. I believe in Jesus' sacrifice, so I trust I'm going to heaven. I don't really fear the virus or death. Is this wrong, and am I just being cocky?
Are you just being cocky not to fear the virus? I think it's an interesting question, because I think we live in a society which is very much governed by fear at the moment. And in some ways that's understandable, as we, you know, look around and see the numbers of people who are dying, and a virus which obviously is in some cases incredibly dangerous. But at the same time, you know, it's good to not give into project fear, as it were, and to look at it realistically. So on a purely rational and realistic level, if you're young and healthy, the chances of you dying of coronavirus are quite low. So in that sense, actually, it's good to kind of keep a sense of perspective. You know, thankfully, the projected mortality rate, it would appear, is going to be a lot lower than it was initially thought, partly because a lot more people probably have had it that we don't know about and things like that. And so actually I wouldn't say, hey, we all need to be sitting here petrified. And certainly I'd say myself, this is not something I sit and worry about. And that partly that's because I've always known that I'm mortal. I know I'm going to die at some point of something. There's still more likelihood statistically that I'm going to die, you know, driving down a road than I am going to die of coronavirus potentially. So does that mean it's wrong not to be worried? Well, no, I wouldn't say that. But at the same time, I think it's good to live our lives with a healthy sense of our own mortality. not in a kind of morbid way, but in a way that says, yeah, actually, I'm not going to live forever in this world right now. And I want to make the most of this life that I've got now, and live in the light of eternity and what lies beyond as well. Those are good things to do.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael. I'm going to just give you a little chance to have a little break, and I'm just going to take the opportunity to mention how you can follow up for those of you watching. So if you do have more questions, maybe a bit more deeper about faith and this whole religion thing, we do have the opportunity for you to read an account of Jesus' life. And this can be, as Michael mentioned before, through an Uncover mark. And you can read this with a CU member, a Christian Union member, and you can contact us via two ways. You can either send a text to the number on the screen, which is on information below, and just ask them if you would like, just message saying, yeah, I'd like to find out more, and I'd love to read this book with somebody. Or you could message the Newcastle Christian Union Facebook page directly, and then hopefully they'll link you up with somebody and you can find out more that way. I'd also really like to encourage you, if you would love to know more about Jesus, about Christianity, about having faith, there are so many online churches at the moment who which are, all together during this time, and yeah, I'd really recommend that you do check those out. But yeah, thank you for that. I'll hand it over to Alice.
Great, yeah. Thank you very much, everybody, for joining today. It's been really great to hear from you, Michael, so thank you for that. Yeah, we'll just thank everybody from some places. Thank you from everybody in Newcastle and Northern Ireland, seems to be a lot of you. Liverpool and Leeds, yeah, just thank you so much, all of you, for joining in. Just please like the Newcastle Christian Union Facebook page if you want to hear more about events like this in the future. Yeah, so thank you. Officially, the hour is up, so if you have to dash, please do, but please do stick around. We're going to ask Michael a few more questions just for 15 minutes or so whilst, yeah, we've still got him with us. So thank you. We'll go back to the next question. I'll hand over to Anne for the next question.
Cool. Yeah, so Michael, if you're happy, I'll ask the next question. So this is the ultimate question: who is Jesus?
I think that's probably one of the most important questions we can ask, isn't it? And actually, even if you're not particularly religious, it's a kind of important question to ask, because he is the figure that's split history in two, who more people claim to follow than anyone else, the majority of our world's population. And so it's kind of obvious to ask the question, well, who is this person? And I guess for many people in the secular West, he's a kind of interesting religious figure who had some nice moral values and the founder of the world's biggest religion. But one of the things I find when I actually start reading through one of the books, like the Uncover book that we're offering you, is that actually, like, he is so much more incredible than I would have ever imagined. So often we kind of put him in the kind of good category of religious leader, and yet Jesus is so quantifiably different to other religious leaders. I mean, Muhammad never claims to be God. In fact, he would have seen such a claim to be blasphemous. And yet Jesus makes claims again and again that only God could make. He claims to forgive people's sin. He claims to predate, a religious leader, Abraham, who died 2,000 years before. He claimed that the whole Old Testament pointed towards him, and he accepted people's worship. He said that he was going to be the judge of all of history and so forth. So he makes these incredible claims that actually, rightly understood, could only be made by someone who thought they were God. Which leaves us with this problem, which is, well, was he just a nutcase then? This guy who's just making these ridiculous... I mean, if I was to make such claims, you would probably conclude that. And yet he also does these kind of things that seem to vindicate the claims he makes. So he, we've thought about some of them. He can walk on water. He can calm a storm. He can heal the sick. He can raise the dead. But in particular, as we thought about earlier, he can go through death itself and come back from the other side in his resurrection. So then we had to start taking him seriously, because we say, well, if he actually did that kind of stuff, then, well, he doesn't seem like a nutter. And we actually need to take seriously his words. Maybe he really is what Christians call the revelation of God, a picture as it were, of what God is like, and a revelation that we can start to get to grips with. But then the other thing I find amazing about Jesus is he doesn't just tell me that there might be a God who's out there because he's walked and talked on planet Earth, but he also helps me to start to figure out what God is like. And what I discover is that he's so different to kind of my expectations of what I think God might be like, because Jesus does things that you don't expect of a religious person. He goes to a party and he turns water into wine. And we would think that maybe religious people should be turning wine into water because they've already had too much to drink. But Jesus says that actually he's come to bring life. And this is a picture of the joy that he brings to people as he turns water into wine. He goes into a place of worship and he kicks people out and turns the place upside down because people are using religion basically for their own ends and to make money. Because Jesus is so opposed to the way that religion often gets used and abused in our world. And then he paints this incredible picture of a God who loves us and longs for us to live in relationship with him. And then through his death on the cross, offers us this amazing opportunity to come into relationship with him. And you say, hey, that's not the kind of God that I would have imagined. This is not the Freudian God of our projections. And this is the God that Jesus shows. So that's why we want to say, why not read through Uncover? Because I think you'll just get blown away by what you read. And then as you read it, why not meet up, metaphorically speaking, over Zoom with a friend in the Christian Union and say, let's look at this together. There's some great discussion questions at the back that help you discuss what you're reading and think about it as well. But yeah, huge question.
Great, thank you. So this is the last question we've got. So if anybody else has any other questions, feel free to send them in. We've got a few minutes left. So last question. Are Christians the best equipped for dealing with the coronavirus mentally?
Well, that's a good question. Are Christians best equipped mentally to deal with coronavirus? I guess what I want to say is a couple of things. Firstly, it depends what we mean by mentally equipped. We do know that some people find circumstances to affect them more emotionally and mentally than others, not because of any moral failing on their own parts, but just some people find emotionally things are more difficult, and something like this, not just potentially coronavirus and the threat of possible death, but being locked down, the uncertainties of life and everything else, will have a much bigger implication for them than it will necessarily for other people. There's nothing to feel bad about that. It's just partly the way we're wired, and all of us are wired in different ways. And therefore, some people will take events like this in their stride just more easily because of the way they're wired. Other people won't. So in a sense, that's got nothing to do with faith. That's got to do with the makeup of our mental well-being and everything else. But on the other hand, I would say the way in which we look at the world, our beliefs about the world, and the way in which we look at the future also does have a massive implication for the way that we feel and the way that we perceive life. And I think the Christian faith enables me to make sense of what I see in the world, confront the brokenness and see it as just that, real brokenness and pain, but also have a real sense of hope. And in that sense, I want to say Christianity does really help me mentally. That doesn't mean that I compare Christian A with non-Christian B and say Christian A, therefore, is more mentally stable and happier than non-Christian B, if you get my example, because of all the things I said at the beginning. But what I would say is that Christian A will have more peace, hope, and security than they would have done if they didn't know Jesus in the situation that they're in. So yes, I think it really does make a difference to us. But I don't think we need to feel guilty if we find times like this, times that make us anxious. And some of us will be in much more difficult situations than others. Christian faith doesn't say we have to deny those feelings, but it does give us a God that we can turn to with those feelings and the promise that he is going to be with us in the midst of it all.
Great, so we've just got one more question in.
Okay.
If you believe Christianity and Jesus' life is the ultimate truth and hope, what about people who have no exposure to Christianity or who follow other faiths?
Yeah, that's a good question. It's a kind of natural question, I guess, to ask towards the end of something like this, because we've kind of looked at these radical, life-changing claims that Jesus makes. And the kind of obvious question is, therefore, well, look, there's lots of people in the world who don't believe this, or don't even have the capacity, or not the capacity, but the opportunity to be able to hear about this. So where does it leave them? I think it's worth distinguishing between those who don't believe this, but have the opportunity to, and those who have never had the same kind of explicit opportunity to hear about Jesus in the way that maybe we do, living in the UK with the facilities that we have. The reality is that God gives us a choice of what we do with him, what we do with Jesus, what we do with the kind of stuff we've heard today. That's not because he doesn't care, it's because he does care, but God longs for relationship, not just religion and ritual. God could force us into knowing him, but it certainly wouldn't be a loving relationship, just as, you know, a relationship with my wife wouldn't be a loving relationship if it was done at, you know, gunpoint rather than voluntarily. And so God gives people a choice, and the reality is people can choose to reject it, and people can choose, wonderfully, of course, to accept it. And so that's the world we live in. God isn't going to force people to believe in him against their will, or against their choice. No, he gives us that choice. And I'd say, tragically, people can choose to reject that. But I'd also want to say, why? You know, if this is true, if this is what Jesus offers us, then why would we want to do that? You know, that would just seem crazy to me. But it does raise the other question, which is, well, there's obviously a lot of people in the world who don't necessarily have the opportunities that we have. And is God going to say to them ultimately, well, I'm just really sorry, you just lived in the wrong part of the world? Or, you know, I'm really, really sorry, you just lived at the wrong point in history. If you just lived at another time, another place, it would have been okay. Well, actually, the Bible does kind of address that question in the New Testament, because Jesus, in the gospel accounts, says something very interesting to the people that he had witnessed his miracles firsthand. Speaking to the cities where he had performed a lot of his miracles and given a lot of his teaching, he actually says over them, he says, woe to you, Chorazin, woe to you, Capernaum, these two cities. If the miracles done in you, he says, had been done in, and then he names some of the cities and towns of the Old Testament who obviously hadn't heard of Jesus because they lived at a different point in a different place. If the miracles done amongst you had been done in them, they would have repented. And then he says it will be more bearable for them than it will be for you. That's a really profound thing Jesus is saying. For a start, Jesus is saying he takes into account the fact that some people have better opportunities than others. You know, these people literally got more than us. They got to see Jesus, to witness his miracles, to hear his teaching. We don't get that. And some people don't get what we have. Jesus takes that into account. Jesus also says that God's judgment takes that into account. It will be more bearable for them than for you, he says. So actually, that's worth remembering. But also, and this is the really profound thing, Jesus says he knows not only what we have done with what we do know, but also what they would have done with what they didn't know. They would have repented, is what Jesus says. So I can trust that God not only knows what I have done with what I know, but I can also trust that God knows what other people would have done with what they never had the opportunity to know. And therefore I can trust that God will be just and fair in that situation. Therefore, being in the wrong place at the wrong time doesn't exclude someone from the possibility of experiencing ultimately what the Bible speaks about. But I also shouldn't use that as an excuse to say, well, it doesn't matter what I do, because the reality is, hey, we do have stacks of opportunities to look into this. So we can't really play the I never heard card. Because I'm sorry, you stayed right to the end of this, so now you're not in that situation. But seriously, like, we need to really decide, you know, what are you going to do with this? And wonderfully, you know, we can therefore have a fuller understanding of what it is to know Jesus than many people would ever have.
Thank you, Michael. I think we have time for just one more question, if that's okay. Do Christians have the capacity to look at the evidence critically if they are scared of death and therefore desperate to believe?
Yes, interesting question. Thank you so much for asking it. That's a good question. Scared of death, do we have the capacity to look at the evidence of something like the resurrection of Jesus critically? it takes into account, doesn't it, that question, the fact that none of us are just brains on legs walking around making purely rational decisions based only on the evidence available to us and nothing to do with our emotions or our feelings. The reality is that all of us are people. We have brains that think, but we also have emotions, we have desires, we have fears and anxieties and everything else. And they all serve to make up who we are, and they all affect the way that we process things. So absolutely, the fear of death can affect the way we look at the world. But so could the fear of judgment as well. So just as you might say someone deliberately looks at the evidence for Jesus and believes it's true because they're fearful of death and they want hope, we might equally say that someone looks at the evidence for Jesus and dismisses it all because they don't like the idea that maybe there is a day of accountability or a day of judgments. See? So in both ways, our feelings can skew the way that we come to the evidence. And you might say, well, I'd never do that. But I mean, it's interesting. You get someone like Thomas Nagel, professor of philosophy at New York University. He's very honest. He says, it's not just I don't believe in Christianity. He says, I don't want it to be true. I don't want there to be a world like that. And he says, I'm really surprised because so many of my intelligent friends do believe it. And he admits that actually part of his disbelief isn't just led by evidence, it's led by desire. So absolutely, our desires affect the way that we look into evidence and the way that we make decisions, both ways, whether we end up Christian, whether we end up atheist. I guess the question therefore remains, is it possible to discover truth if we are affected by our desires? There are some people who would say no, like basically we are so driven by desires that affect our judgments that it is impossible to know the truth. But if that's the case, then we have to say, well, that's not just the case when it comes to God and the resurrection, it's the case in life in general. But what kind of world would we live in if we disregard the very possibility of discovering any kind of truth? If we immediately assume that when someone has a kind of truth claim or a conviction about a truth claim, that they've just come to that conclusion because they want it to be true. I think what we have to say is, yeah, these things affect the way we process stuff, and we need to take that into account. But taking that into account, we can then be aware of our particular biases and still look at the evidence and come to conclusions. And I think that's what we need to do, be aware of our natural biases. There's a great book, by the way, all about this called Thinking Fast and Slow, by a guy called Daniel Kahneman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economic Theory. And he basically says that we need to take into account our unthought through biases that skew our judgments. Because as we do so, we'll actually be able to sit down and process things more fully. And he says in the book, we need to think slowly rather than fast. Thinking fast is when you just have an immediate hunch, that can't be true, or that's true. And Christians can do that. Oh yeah, I believe in the resurrection, but they've not thought it through. But then an atheist can do it too, can't they? Oh, it's ridiculous. Of course Jesus didn't rise from the dead, but they've not thought it through either. Thinking slow, Daniel Kahneman says, is when you actually stop to weigh up the evidence and say, all things considered, where do I go with this? It's more work, which is why people don't like to do it. We prefer to kind of think fast and go on our intuition. But if we're not to make mistakes, then we need to think more slowly and to weigh stuff up. So that's what we'd say it's really good to do. Weigh this up, start to look at the evidence, look at the arguments, read the best arguments by Christians, read the best arguments by atheists, weigh them up, see what you think, and discuss it. But I think as you do so, and that's something I've tried to do throughout my life really, and particularly as a Christian, I've become increasingly compelled that this really is true as I've opened up to scrutiny and investigation. And so we'd encourage you to do the same.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Michael, for answering all those questions. And thank you to everyone as well who sent in those questions. They're fantastic. If you would like to know more, I'm just going to reiterate what I said earlier. If you do have more questions to ask, and you would like to know more about the life of Jesus, we can send you a copy of the Uncover Mark, which Michael mentioned earlier, and we can set you up with someone from the Christian Union at Newcastle to read that with you. And you can organise this by either texting and just messaging us at the number 0759 044 3024. Or you could either message the Newcastle Facebook Christian Union page. And again, I'd just like to say, if you would like to know more, genuinely, about churches and being involved. We can also send you to online churches here in Newcastle. So please do get in touch with us if you would like to know more. I'm just going to hand it over to Alice to do a final.
Great. Yeah, thank you. Just thank you again, Michael, for talking with us today, for taking the time out of your day to do this. Just again, thank you from people from Sheffield and York and Weston. I'm not sure where that is, but yeah, thank you for all of you for joining us today. Just please do get in touch with us if you have any more questions. It's great that even at a time like this, when we're all separated, we can answer all your questions. We can try our hardest, and we can really just all be in it together as well. So thank you, Michael. Thank you everybody for joining, and we'll hopefully hear from you and maybe see you soon. Bye.
Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.